So I am very pleased to introduce to you Dr. Simon Young, who joins us, as I say, all the way from sunny Italy. Simon's a British folklore historian who is now based over in Italy. He's written on 19th century supernatural aspects of various things, particularly Victorian urban legends, of which he has a new book coming out soon. Is also heavily involved with the Fairy Investigation Society and the Fairy Census, and obviously has done a lot of field work on today's subject of boggarts, which informed his latest book, which was out recently from the University of Exeter Press, and which at the end of today's presentation, we will be able to offer you a significant discount code on, thanks to University of Exeter Press, should you wish to buy one. Simon's also the editor of Exeter New Approaches to Legends, Folklore and Popular Legends, which is a new series of books coming out from the University of Exeter Press, and teaches history over at the University of Virginia's Siena campus in Italy. He's run courses in the past on the history of Christianity, Italian food history, media history, World War II in Italy, and Italian Renaissance history, amongst many other things. But today we'll be talking about the subject of his latest book, which is the supernatural fairy creature known as the boggart. So without further ado, I will pass over to Simon for his talk, and I will join you again at the end for the Q&A. Simon, welcome.
Mark, thank you so much for this introduction, and thanks to Crediton Library for hosting this, and thanks to all of you for coming to listen. I've recognised some names among the mass, and it's always very exciting for me to be able to speak about boggarts, albeit for half an hour or 40 minutes, a favourite subject of mine. As far as today goes, what I would really like to do is split the talk into 4 small sections. I'd like to start by talking about the when and where of boggarts. I'd then like to go on to talk about this supernatural creature and how our idea of the boggart is completely different from the idea that was common over parts of Britain, say 100, 150 years, or for that matter, 500 years ago. And then I'd like to talk about what some people think of as a very dry subject, but that I think is absolutely fundamental for understanding the British supernatural, and indeed any supernatural system. And that's the way that the supernatural is classified by believers. And then I'll finish just by talking about the promising new roads that are opening up for the study of British folklore history. And we really do live in an age like no other. The last 20 years has seen a massive increase in opportunities to study the folk beliefs and the supernatural beliefs of the past. Okay, well, if I was physically present with you in a room, I would start a lecture like this by asking some volunteers to tell me what a boggart is. Zoom, of course, has advantages as well as disadvantages, but one of the great things for me about Zoom is the chat section. And I was going to set you this challenge, those of you who feel that you have a certain amount of knowledge about British folklore, and I was going to ask for a definition of a boggart, and I wondered if perhaps you could limit yourself to between 1 and 5 words and just spend the next 2 or 3 minutes writing or thinking of a definition that you would be happy with in the chat section. The chat section can be reached. If you look down below, I'm staring at it at the moment. There are already 30 comments there, so I think most of you will not have trouble finding it. And what I'm going to do is come back to these definitions in a minute. But just to start with, I want to give you a sense of the history and the geography of the boggart before we get on to talking about what the boggart is, and perhaps more importantly, what it has become. I'm going to open here a shared screen, and I'm starting with this little bit of British supernatural folklore history. This is a screenshot of one of the earliest Bibles printed in English. This is from the early 1500s. The 1500s is a very exciting time in terms of supernatural history, because it's the period when the old supernatural order seems to break down, and there emerges a series of new names and new ideas. And some old survivors, like the British fairies, take on slightly new guises. And the boggart is something of a parvenu, a newcomer on the scene. And this is the very first mention of it. And I'm going to take you with my cursor to the relevant word, if I can find it. Here we are. This is one of the very first translations of the Bible into English. And here we have from one of the apocryphal books of the Bible. These are books that would not later appear in the Protestant Bibles. We have the word Fray Boggart. Fray Boggart is here standing service for the Latin word for scarecrow. There's a long tradition in Britain and indeed elsewhere to give scarecrows the name of supernatural monsters. There is the idea that scarecrows do to birds what these bogies and monsters do to us. They terrify us. And this is our first hint of this new supernatural being, the boggart, which has swum in to the British firmament sometimes in the 1500s. Now, this word will repeat once more. It appears in a title deed for a house in the later 1500s. And then in the 1600s, we have 14 references to the word boggart in all kinds of different contexts. And then in the 1700s, we get to the Enlightenment, where writers tend to be a bit sniffier about the supernatural, and references go down. We have a mere 9 references. And then this is the point that matters. In the 1800s, we have, without any exaggeration, thousands of individual references to the boggart. And the great thing about studying the boggart and my experience in writing the book on boggarts was that there was suddenly this burst of sources in the 1800s that have particularly become available to scholars in the last 20 years with digitization. I would say not the vast majority, but the majority of the most interesting sources were 19th century newspapers that would never have been found without digitization. And this has been a gift of the last generation or so. So much for a little history of boggart. Again, I'm going to come to the definition in a minute. I'll look through the chat and see what you've all written. But let me give you a sense here also of the geography of boggart. And here I've borrowed a couple of maps that appear in the University of Exeter book. And I've given you what for me is a very crude map. And this is the kind of maps that folklorists effectively depended on until relatively recent times. If you look in a folklore encyclopedia to see what a boggart is, you will learn very frequently that it's a north of England supernatural entity or being. And these counties up here are based on Joseph Wright's extraordinary dialect dictionary. This is one of the monuments of British scholarship put together at the end of the 1800s by a young man who was illiterate until he was 16 and who by 34 was professor of comparative philology at Oxford, an absolutely extraordinary individual. Joseph Wright grew up in Bradford, where the word boggart was frequently used. And this map is based on Joseph Wright's claims for where boggarts can be found in Britain. Now, this is somewhat of a scattershot approach, and in many cases it's faulty. If you look, for example, to the far northwest, you see Cumberland. This is based on a single solitary reference. It was actually a misunderstood reference. Cumberland should be deleted. Ditto Westmoreland, that maybe saw the use of the word boggart in the extreme south of the county, but nowhere else. Yorkshire, only really the very western parts, the West Riding of Old Yorkshire, commonly use boggart. And going towards the south, for example, the counties of Worcestershire and Wiltshire, the reference boggart here is from a single informant, and it refers to a scarecrow. As Crediton is hosting us tonight, I'll also spend a minute on Devon. Joseph Wright included Devon under the word boggart because of a supernatural entity believed to dwell in Wells, the Bowker, that Joseph Wright thought might be somehow related to boggart. That's unlikely. A much more reliable way to get a sense of where the boggarts ruled the night and terrified locals is this second map. It seems like just a game of dots, but this took the best part of 4 years to put together. Essentially, it is a list of all place names in Britain that use the element boggart. So boggart lanes, boggart houses, Boggart Woods. And what I've done is put this sprinkle on the map just to show you the most reliable metric for tracing where Boggart beliefs were found. What you see here is a square of maybe 10% of England that is centered really on Lancashire and the West Riding. Now, with this, I'm going to leave the shared screen and just go for a second to see what your views are in the chat on definitions for Boggart. We have lots of different and some very creative ones. I love some of these. A scary supernatural being, solitary, unfriendly fairy. I'll take issue in a couple of minutes with that word fairy in the nicest possible way. A nighttime stalker, I think, does very good. A species or subgenre of fairy, a mischievous or malevolent being inhabiting a particular home or farm. And these are perhaps, particularly that last one, comes closest to the kind of definitions that you will get in our great folklore dictionaries. And I brought with me today one of my favourite folklore books. This is Catherine Briggs presenting her Dictionary of Fairies. This was a book that was put together at the very end of Catherine's life. I think it was published in 1977. And I'm just going to read for you Catherine's definition of the Boggart. Given how important this book has been, this definition has also been very influential. Catherine Briggs writes, and I quote, "A Boggart is a mischievous brownie, in other words, a house spirit, almost exactly like a poltergeist in his habits." And that's it. And then she goes on to tell a famous story that I'll refer to in a couple of minutes about a Boggart that haunts a house, causes trouble for the family, and can be not got rid of. Now, this idea that Catherine Briggs gives us here is an idea that's been kicking around in British folklore for a long time. It's an idea that I should say right at the beginning is only part of the story. And it's interesting here how the people who've studied folklore have taken a more general definition and have narrowed it down to this idea of a house spirit or a house imp. And with this, I'm going to go back and show you some images. In my experiences, images are often the best way to internalize these things. And I'm going to show you a few of our very rare images of Boggarts before the 21st century. And I'm going to start with, to the best of our knowledge, to the best of my knowledge anyway, the first labelled image of a Boggart from anywhere. In 1829, John Roby, the father of Lancashire folklore, published his book, The Traditions of Lancashire, and he included a story in this book called The Boggart. Now, this story, curiously, was not written by John Roby. It was about Boggart Hole Clough, a famous park to the north of Manchester, now well within the conurbation. And Thomas Crediton Croker was essentially bullied by John Roby, we have the letters, into writing a story. And Crediton Croker, in a fit, I suspect, of desperation and just wanting to get Roby off his back, shamelessly really plagiarized one of the very few printed Yorkshire stories about Boggarts and transferred it across the border to Boggart Hole Clough. This was then put into print, and this was a southern illustrator, I think it's Cruikshank, who puts together our first image of a Boggart. And here, this becomes the story that defines the genre, that becomes the Boggart, not for people in the area of Boggart belief, what I sometimes refer to as Boggartdom, but further afield, the kind of people who were reading folklore books. And this becomes a tradition that then is difficult to break out with. I'll show you a second image here. This is from 1865, and this is from one of our most interesting British folklore fiction writers from the Victorian period, Juliana Horatio Ewing. She was a rather prim and proper Yorkshire woman, the daughter of a Yorkshire reverend, and she knew British folklore very, very well, and she fictionalized British folklore in a series of short stories for children, and she did this in actually a very talented fashion, but what she was writing was not in any sense folklore proper. In this story, which is her single most influential story, it's called The Brownies, she describes how there are spirits who run around houses. And these spirits, when they're good, are brownies. They're helping the human inhabitants of the house. And when they're bad, they become boggarts, and they're naughty and they cause problems. And for Juliana Horatio Ewing, this creature was supposed to represent the child. And there is the idea that children reading this story would be brownies, not boggarts. Now, if this was old, this would be a curiosity of Victorian literature. But just after the Great War, Lord Baden-Powell read this story and was inspired by it in creating an identity for the first Girl Scouts in Britain. And one of the consequences of this is that he called the younger branch of the Girl Scouts the Brownies. And right up until the 70s, probably in some backward parts up until the 80s, young children were taken to the Brownies. They were taught and told how to be good girls, how to be brownies, and they were warned of the fate of being boggarts. And often in guide games, and particularly brownie games, the boggart featured, for example, a classic brownie game was to get 6 or 7 young girls in a circle and whisk around the skipping rope. The brownies would jump the skipping rope, and if the skipping rope caught your ankles, then the boggart had got you and you were out of the game. And in fact, doing my studies on the boggarts, I frequently came across people who knew the word boggart from their time in the Girl Guides or their time in the Brownies or parts of the scouting movement. And it should be said that for any of you like me who love the works of Catherine Briggs, the second most important thing in Catherine Briggs' life after folklore was she was a leading girl guider. And her reference from the dictionary comes straight from the fiction of Juliana Horatio Ewing, not from British folklore. I'll give you another image here. Here we're back in Lancashire. And this is a volume, I think it's from just after the Great War. I think it's the early 20s. And this is a repeat version of the story that had been written or plagiarized a century before by Thomas Crofton Croker. We're back in Boggart Hole Clough. We're back with a family that's suffering from a naughty spirit in the house. And here you have this lovable imp simultaneously pulling the hair, but also carrying flowers. So boggarts are not all bad. And then I'll go to some more modern representations. This is from a film from the early 2000s. This is the Spiderwick Chronicles, a film I suffered through with my children. And in this film, an American family move into an old house somewhere in New England, and the children discover that there is a house spirit in the family, and this house spirit is a brownie. It helps the family, but when it becomes bad-tempered, it becomes the creature you see in front of you now. It turns into a boggart. And so we have this constant imagery of imp-like, little demon-like creatures, humanoid creatures, orcoid creatures, going through the decades. And this has continued into the history of cinema. I'll give you one last, for me, delightful version of this. I was given very kind permission by the sculptors to include this image in my book. This is Lee Nicholson and Victoria Morris. This is a picture based on a sculpture that is now found in, very suitably, Pendle Sculpture Park in the very middle of Boggartdom. And this is, I think, an image from straight out of the collective conscious as to what boggarts actually are. Again, you have this little imp-like figure that's there and waiting for us. Now, I'm going to leave again the shared screening. And I'm just going to talk about how this is a very limited and arguably incorrect view of what boggarts actually are. When I started studying boggarts, I came into this thinking of the boggarts as a type of fairy, a type of imp-like creature, much as these images here. And it took me several years, I think, to realize that this was only a very partial representation of what was actually going on in the folklore accounts. And the way that I was able to break through was that I looked for dialect guides from Boggartdom, so again, the area where Boggarts are believed in, and I collected together the different definitions. Between 1850 and 1950, I was able to find 26 dialect guides from different areas where Boggarts were or had been a thing. And not a single one of them described a Boggart as a house spirit. They would have used words like brownie, words from Scots English. They would have used hob, the traditional English word for a house spirit, or maybe they would have even gone back to an older word from the time of Milton, a lubber fiend, but none of these words were used. Half of the definitions of Boggarts was simply a one-word answer, ghost. There is the idea that the Boggarts were related very often to the undead, and there's no question that this is true when we look at our sources. And then there were also more general labels like spectre or apparition, or perhaps even locutions like something that goes bump in the night, something frightening to meet at night. And here we come close to some of the great definitions that were given in the chat earlier. And I thought, just to give you a sense of the difference between what we think Boggarts are and what they actually were in the imagination of people living in Boggartdom in the 1700s and the 1800s, and perhaps even a little bit later, I'd show you a series of images that represent this other side of the coin. And here I'm going to go back to, I hope my screen, let's hope we've got it. I'm afraid this is annoying. I seem to have lost my full screen here. Let me just whiz through again to get us there. This will teach me to use the escape button. Here we go. Here we're into images that people in 19th century Lancashire or 19th century Cheshire, say, would have related to much more easily as a Boggart. I'm going to start by showing you two images from a work of the early 1880s by James Bowker. James Bowker wrote a book called The Goblin Tales of Lancashire. Now, my suspicion is that if Bowker had just been writing for a Lancashire audience, he would have called these the Boggart Tales of Lancashire. He frequently refers to the bogies he talks about in the book as Boggart, but I imagine his London publisher just felt that this was a step too far to call a Boggart a Boggart, because most people in the capital or in the southern shires simply wouldn't have understood the word. And here we have a typical English folklore beast. A woman is walking along the road. A man on horseback invites her onto the back of the horseback. She puts her arms around him, and at this point he turns around, and to his horror he sees that actually she is a monster. She is a Boggart. And for me, the best part of this image, I was looking at it earlier today, is the man's terrified face. I think this wood engraving gets that very, very well. Very often Boggarts were outdoor creatures. They were also in houses, but they were frequently found outdoor, and they frequently also had, let's say, a Baroque touch to them. They're not the kind of thing you would find in a modern horror film. And the next example from near Preston is a lovely instance of this. Here you have a nighttime pedestrian walking along who meets a woman going along silently in the dark. Remember, this is long before gas lights out on country roads or electric lights, so it's very dark. And he begins a conversation with the woman, but the conversation goes nowhere because she will not reply to him. And at a certain point, thanks to a strategic glimmer of moonlight, he sees to his horror that the woman does not have a head. And looking down, he sees that she's carrying, the Boggart is carrying her head in the basket. He very understandably takes to his heels, starts running off through the night, and the Boggart hurls her head after him. And this image here is the front cover of the University of Exeter Press book I've just released on the Boggart. And so I hope here a picture that brings you back towards the Boggart of yesterday. This is actually an image from London, not from Lancashire, but this is an interesting transference of a Lancashire story. Garstang is a town in Lancashire. And in the 1870s, a story began to do the rounds in Garstang. And this is a frequent occurrence in 19th century newspapers for various towns, villages, and indeed for the outskirts of many cities, that there was a boggart about. Garstang Boggart, it was called. Journalists in Manchester and Liverpool were fascinated by this story. It was easy copy, taken from a shire paper and put out in the city paper. And from there, it was taken down towards London, and it appears here in an illustrated form in the London Illustrated News. But of course, again, the word boggart would have meant nothing. So where a Manchester or Liverpool newspaper would have no problem in writing Garstang Boggart, and know that all its readers would understand what was happening, in London, the word was sensibly translated into Garstang Ghost. And here we have this great image. The main story connected with the Garstang Boggart is that the local postman refused to do his rounds after dark after having encountered the boggart. And here an imaginative London journalist, illustrators put together this great image. And I think here they're trying to get the best of both worlds. They've put together an image which suggests the ethereal nature of the supernatural, but at the same time, there is this rather peculiar mask. And we know from many, many news reports in the 19th century that a hobby of many, particularly young men, was to chase around the countryside, dressed in unusual ways and scare locals into thinking there was a ghost out and about. And the way that this mask has been drawn makes me think that the illustrator here was plugging into that tradition. A final picture, and I owe this to Lucy Evans. Lucy came across this just fabulous image in a Manchester library. And you can see at the bottom a line from Edwin War's most famous poem. But for me, this is the greatest of all the boggart images. And it's great because you have a young man who is frightened, walking, obviously, full moon. It's sometime out in the countryside at dark. But what you have here is the boggart lurking in the background. And this is the key point to so much supernatural experiences that we read about in the 19th century. And I'm sure it's true of supernatural experiences through history. It certainly remains true to the present, that very often the supernatural is so horrifying that it is only glimpsed. And this image here, I think, does a very good job of this. The boggart is indeterminate. It's clearly something vaguely humanoid and vaguely horrible, but the details are left out of the account. Now, I've tried to give you these images just to give you a sense of how the boggart is maybe different from these imp-like figures I was showing you at the beginning, and that I think now represents the main tradition of understanding boggarts in British folklore. But I think collectively people have real problems dealing with this. And I was talking about this on a social media site the other day, and a very kindly gentleman confronted me with his own views on this. And he said to me, "Oh, and in my area of Lancashire, a boggart wasn't always an unwanted evil presence. They seem to have aspects of old household spirits who expected a level of respect in offerings, but in who return would help find lost items." Now, this is a part of boggart lore, but it's a tiny part of what it was in the 19th century. However, notice the most important thing from this screenshot, even with my frankly pathetic social media outreach, this gentleman immediately got 23 likes on this. In other words, this represents a fairly common opinion. And so what I've tried to do to convince the likes of this person, and hopefully yourselves tonight, is to set this out as a family tree of the supernatural of the Northwest. And what you're seeing here is an attempt to classify the supernatural using local terms. In Lancashire, as in many parts of Britain, the fundamental difference with the supernatural was between good on the one hand and then ambivalent or evil on the other. And good was pretty much monopolized by the angels, who are fantastic creatures, but sometimes a little bit tedious in 19th century accounts. Much more interesting are the evil or ambivalent creatures. And the word that was used in Lancashire for these beings was fairies. And the fairies just means the frightening ones. There are different versions of this word in different parts of Britain. For example, in Lincolnshire, I think it was frits. In Shropshire, it was fritnings. I'm trying to think in Westmoreland, to the north of Lancashire, it was fearings. But the sense is these are frightening things. And frightening things break in Northwestern law, particularly Lancashire law, into two types. First of all, on the one hand, we have fairies. Fairies are frequently called fairies in the Northwest. They're these terrifying beings. And the thing that marks fairies apart from boggarts on the other side is that fairies are social creatures. They live in communities. They're frightening, they're ambivalent. According to some points of view from the 19th century, they were evil, but they are apart. On the other side, you have boggarts, and boggart is simply, in the 19th century, a general word. When I started studying the boggarts, I felt that I was studying a type of supernatural being, the house imp that we saw images of before. And very painfully and very slowly, I came to realize that what I was actually studying was a subsection of the supernatural, the solitary beast that terrified Lancashire folk or Northwestern folk. And I've given you some examples of these here. We have, for example, the kind of ghosts you would find in house. Imagine the silk rustling, a blanket maybe being pulled off your bed. We have the shapeshifters that go back comfortably to the works of Shakespeare and beyond. These are the canine creatures that become a bear, that become a fire, that become a deer, that become a sheep, that are constantly shifting forms and terrifying walkers. We have household spirits. The spirits we talked about before were very much described as boggarts, but they were a tiny part of the overall boggart population. Ghosts were much, much more common, or these kind of outdoor creatures I've been showing you images of were far more common. We also have demons and devils. These are frequently described as boggarts in Northwestern sources. We have will-o'-the-wisps, sometimes called marsh boggarts. And then we have the various mermaids or undines. The most famous of these for the Northwest is the immortal Jenny Greenteeth, who used to drag children to their deaths in ponds and the like. And Jenny Greenteeth is frequently in the 19th and early 20th century described as a boggart. And so this would be a kind of a family tree of the supernatural in the Northwest. Now, what goes wrong with this sometimes, and here I'm going to hold at Catherine Briggs again, is that Catherine Briggs takes these as being really all on the same level, a series of different supernatural beings. And so Catherine Briggs gives in her encyclopedia a reference to fairies, a reference to boggarts, and a reference to, say, will-o'-the-wisps, as if they're three independent types of supernatural beings. Actually, they're different types of classifications. What Catherine Briggs has done there would be as if a Martian came to planet Earth, went back to Mars and wrote an encyclopedia and included the word mammal, dog, and West Highland Terrier, and argued that these were all different types of animal and gave a different description. It's actually a little bit more complicated than this. Now, I'm going to step out again of the shared screen for a moment or two, because I think that this leads us to the third topic I wanted to talk about, and this is the way we classify the supernatural and look at the supernatural in our sources. Catherine Briggs, for me, represents a tradition of what I think of as the beastery tradition, as in a medieval bestiary, where you put a series of different creatures together on a flat level. You don't explain them in relation to each other. They're just a series of marvelous creatures. And one of the things that's remarkable about Catherine Briggs is just how influential she has been. At 1977, her Fairy Dictionary comes out, and the Fairy Dictionary is a good seller. But what really matters is that Brian Froud and Alan Lee, I think it's 2 years later, published their book Fairies, with illustrations of different supernatural creatures. And this becomes then the model that spreads out from Britain around the world. Britain is often rather provincial in folklore circles, but Catherine Briggs there had an immense influence, not just on British folklore, but folklore from around the world. Now, academics have fought back against this in the past 10 or 20 years, and they've done so in a way that I have come to believe is mistaken. They've done so with a form of nihilism. They've gone in and said, look, the supernatural, it doesn't exist anyway, and so any sense of categories is nonsense. What we have is what's sometimes called the liquid supernatural. You have these various supernatural beings, and terms are just given willy-nilly to these various supernatural beings. And I'm putting up here, by way of penance, an article that I wrote when I started studying folklore. This will be my 10th anniversary is coming up this summer. And this is an article I think I published in 2013. And I entitled this article, Against Taxonomy, the Fairy Families of Cornwall. Now, in this article, I argued that many Victorian folklorists misrepresented and were too keen to break down the different supernatural beings in Cornwall into a kind of birdwatcher's atlas and natural history. I think I was right about that, but I always forget this title, Against Taxonomy. Classification exists in the supernatural as it exists in all forms of human life. And I think that academics have looked for an easy way out in attacking the likes of Catherine Briggs in saying, no, we wash our hands of this. The supernatural doesn't exist, typically academic position, and then saying classification doesn't exist otherwise. And I hope you'll let me, just for the last 5 minutes or so, make the case that there is classification in the supernatural and that this is desperately important and we have to get this right. I want to introduce you quickly to a phrase that's been something of a buzzword for most of the last 40 years, actually most of the last 50 years in anthropology, and this is folk taxonomy. You can find equivalent ideas. You can find equivalent ideas in psychology, and this is the idea that as human beings, we are hardwired to classify things. Now, the scientific version of this, the Linnaean version of this, is a very extreme version. If you take, say, the Linnaean version of this, you would go to the point where you begin at the top of a scale with vegetation and you go all the way down until you get to a rare series of silver birch. And doing that, you would go through 10, 11, sometimes even more levels of classification. Folk taxonomy says, no, human beings are too simple. We cannot deal with these levels of classification, and we tend to boil things down into levels of classification that suit our rather simple and tired minds, but that allow us to make sense of the environment around us. So a classic folk taxonomy might be, and here I'm going to use my cursor again to go back to that example I gave you a minute ago. You could start with vegetation, say. You would then go down into what's called the life form category in folk taxonomy. And here you might say tree or plant or weed. And if any of you are thinking these divisions are not scientific, that's the entire point. When you're doing a folk taxonomy, you don't need to be scientific. This is a need-to-know basis to make sense of the world around you. And from trees, carrying down this route, you might go to birches. And from birches, you might go to silver birches. And because folk taxonomies are very local, they're all about what you know. If there's a last category, it might well be the silver birch that got struck by lightning last year up on the hill. And so you have these rather flat levels of classification. Now, we do this with everything in our lives. And many folk taxonomies make more intuitive sense than scientific classifications of the natural world do. For example, the classic thing where a child who doesn't have scientific points of reference will refuse to believe that a hen is a bird because a hen does not fly. Likewise, in many populations that use folk taxonomies, bats are a type of bird because of course they fly. Likewise, whales, of course, are a type of fish. They're a very big fish, but no one's interested whether they're mammals because you have them in the folk taxonomy to understand them, if necessary to kill them, if necessary if they're dangerous to avoid them. And I would say that exactly this happens with the supernatural. And I think it's very difficult to make sense of supernatural systems until you have some kind of sense of this taxonomy. And I'm going back to this image here just to repeat some of the things I was saying before, but to give it you as this breakdown, this classification that I think was used, for instance, in a town like Burnley in Lancashire in the 19th century, and that has since dissolved away since the time of the Great War. At the very top, you would have the classic breakdown between good and evil. You would then, on the evil or ambivalent side of the supernatural, have fairies, which are a social creature, and then boggarts that represent different styles of solitary creatures. And then you have all the subdivisions. And you could follow this all the way down. So, for example, if you were in Burnley, the shapeshifter would be the local example, the skriker that haunted the churchyard to the north of the town. If you went down to the southeast of what were the boundaries of Burnley, you would have Jenny Greenteeth, who rather atypically lived in a mine shaft. And you also had a paper making factory where a will-o'-the-wisp was frequently seen outside. And so these would be local examples. Now, I think the natural reaction to this, and I saw this when I talked to my poor wife about this last night, was who cares? Who cares about classifying the supernatural in this way? So I just want to give you a final example of how we just get hopelessly confused if we don't do this. This is another of the maps taken from my book, The Boggart. And what I've tried to do here is chart for one tiny portion of northwestern England, local bogies that go by the name of Boggart, Dobie, or Bogle. So typically you would have, now clearly this wouldn't happen in Devon, but you would have the Crediton Boggart, or the Crediton Bogle, or the Crediton Dobie. Again, if you go back to the great Catherine Briggs, each of these three words appear as separate bogies, as separate monsters that deserve their own paragraph explaining how they're different from all the other monsters. What I would say to you is they're nothing of the kind. These three words mean exactly the same thing in these three regions. They're just different geographical versions of the same idea, a general word for solitary supernatural creatures. And so on this map, you'll see in the south, the very northern edge of Boggartdom, where boggarts were the typical general word that was used. You travel into the old county of what was Westmoreland before 1974-75, and Dobie was the word that was used. And then you travel further north into Cumberland, and indeed you can travel all the way through the Scottish borders and all the way through the Scottish lowlands. And the equivalent word there is bogle. These three words meant the same thing. Okay, I'm going to come out of shared screening now and just, whoops. There we go. I'm going to come out of shared screening now, and I'm just going to spend just 2 or 3 more minutes finishing with an appeal I always make in these talks, and I hope that Crediton Library and Mark will be patient with me. We are living, and I hope I've given a sense of this in these slides, through a revolutionary period in the study of historical British folklore. I should say there are lots of really fascinating people out there studying modern folklore, but I am a historian, and I feel that my job is to uncover the belief systems of the 19th century, of the 1800s to 1700s and backwards. And what I've seen already in the decade that I've been studying is this miraculous increase in the number of sources we have available. When Catherine Briggs, all those years ago, wrote her wonderful fairy dictionary, if she had struggled for a year, she would have been lucky to put together, say, 30,000 words on boggarts from the sources that she would find in the British Copyright Library. Together, I have a file here at home of about 500,000 words on boggarts. And the difference between me and Catherine Briggs is I have the internet. It's that simple. I've been able to comb through these sources in the way that she would have if she was still alive. And so I've been able to offer perhaps some nuances that weren't there in the great Catherine Briggs's work. Now, the reason I bring this up is because I'm always aware that there are two possibilities when I talk to a group of people like this. The first possibility is, by some extraordinary miracle, Bill Gates is here listening today, and he has a certain amount of funding that he could throw in the direction of British folklore. But the much greater possibility is that there's someone listening here today who has a great interest in British folklore, and for whatever reason, has a certain amount of time on their hands, or maybe in the future will have that kind of time on their hands. And what I would say to these people is the following. It would be possible in the next 10 or 20 years to absolutely revolutionize our understanding of the historical supernatural in Britain. But we need to do three things. The first of these is we need to go through these 19th century sources, and this is very slow and difficult work. And these sources need to be typed up. You can use character recognition. You can use lots of different methods for doing this, but we need to put together these words, and every 100,000 words or so, they need to be published. We need the democratization of knowledge. This material needs to be shared. The second thing, and this is something where my study of the Boggart has completely changed my mind, is the same or other people, but ideally really the same people, because they'll have the points of reference, need to reach out on social media. This isn't a question of convincing people that folklore is nice or you should buy my book or any of this. What I found with the Boggart is there are still people alive today who have fragments of Boggart lore dating back to Edwardian and Victorian times. And this is material which, of course, will not be here in 10 or 20 years. One of my most ghostly exciting moments writing the Boggart book was chatting at 11:30 at night with a 94-year-old from close to Blackpool who was remembering a Boggart rhyme. I get goosebumps just recalling this to you all, who remembered a Boggart rhyme she had learnt as a young girl and was able to recite this to me. And there straight away, we go back into the interwar period and a poem that can actually be found in texts going back into the 19th century. And then I think that once you bring this material together, both the material from living populations looking back towards the past and the material from all these texts that are there just waiting to be mined, the third thing to do is to create these folklore taxonomies or folk taxonomies of the supernatural. And the painful truth there is it will be necessary, not just to do one for each county, but to do one in some cases for just parts of counties. For instance, my suspicion is that West Cornwall would have a different folk taxonomy from Eastern Cornwall. And so there would be a lot of backbreaking, but very profitable work. Now, I'm aware I may have overstayed my welcome here, so thank you for your patience. And I'm now going to hand back over to Mark. And again, thanks for your attention.
Thanks so much, Simon. You absolutely haven't outstayed your welcome. And there are some great questions, which I'm going to come to in just a moment. I'm just going to mention a couple of things before we do, while you just have a minute to take a breather. The first of those is that Simon has referred to, quite modestly, a couple of times his book. Now, Simon's book on the Boggart is out with the University of Exeter Press, who have very kindly given us a discount code. Here we go. So if you want to buy a copy of the Boggart by Simon Young, then you can do so from the University of Exeter Press website between now and the end of August with that discount code on screen, folklore30. which will give you a 30% discount off of the cover price of the book. Hurrah! Also, there is a source book which goes alongside this book, which is a collection of many of the sources that Simon has been referring to, which is also you can buy as a print book, but you can also download free of charge as a PDF, I think that's right, isn't it, from the University of Exeter Press website. So even if you are not able to purchase the print copy of the Boggart, the main book, you can, for the grand total of nothing, if you wish to do so, download the sources which Simon draws on as the research for that book as a PDF from the University of Exeter Press website. So thanks very much to the University of Exeter Press for setting that up. There is a discount code there, folklore30, if you wish to go off and buy a copy of the book. A couple more things I'll just throw in before I scroll back to where I noticed that the first question or comment was. One is that obviously there is a lot more to this subject than we've been able to cover in this talk even. And you can also listen to an extended interview that I did with Simon recently for my own podcast, which is available on that link in the chat, thefolklorepodcast.com in season 7. And there is quite a lengthy chat that we had about the Boggart in there. Simon does also have his own podcast, Boggart and Banshee, which covers a lot of different aspects of the supernatural, both modern day and particularly Victorian and historical sources. And you can seek out that wherever podcasts are found. And one final point that I think is worth making is that Simon talked about the democratization of knowledge, which is really, really important and something that folklore is very, very good at, actually. Crediton Library is also home to the Folklore Library and Archive, which is seeking to do that very thing, also on the web at folklorelibrary.com, also on Twitter, if you use Twitter at Library Folklore, and that is exactly the sort of thing which the Folklore Library and Archive seeks to do, and does have various resources on the Boggart and other supernatural fey creatures, for want of a better term, including the archive of Ray Loveday, who was a late researcher who researched a variant of the fey called the Heike sprite. And through Simon, we have now got Ray's entire archive, which we are currently digitizing and will make available freely on the website for people who want to look at that. We're just in the process of redacting personal names and telephone numbers from the correspondence file, which obviously we're not allowed to publish freely, but that will be available very, very soon. Oh, Chris has just put in there, the podcast is Boggart and Banshee, a supernatural podcast. Thank you very much, Chris. Right, I am going to scroll back to 4:15, where I noticed the first comment that we really ought to talk about. Oh, and the other thing I must remember to do is do that. Right, you are now able to start your camera if you wish to join us in the room in a video way, as Paolo has just done. And in fact, the first comment is Paolo's, who notes that there are accounts of a Boggart at Creech Hill, which is near Staunton Drew in southeast Bristol, obviously outside of the normal orbit of the Boggart. Your comment to make on that particular example, Simon? Is that one you've come across?
No, not at all. So Paolo, when I was looking at the definitions for Boggart that I asked, I saw this and gulped rather, because I've never come across a reference to a Boggart outside that northern area I was talking about. Now, my only guess there would be that because this idea that a Boggart is a house spirit, and because this idea has become so common, sometimes the word Boggart has been transferred and used in that way to explain creatures. elsewhere in the country. And this happened in the 19th century with the word brownie. Brownie was a word that was used above all in the Scottish lowlands, but very quickly in the 1800s, it was a word that got wider currency. And I can say that I've come across references to boggarts in southwestern sources, but always in fiction, only in fiction. And so for me, this is a new piece of information that I look forward to following up. And so thanks for that.
Paolo, you should be able to unmute yourself if there's anything, because I think I just asked you to. There you go. If you've got anything you want to add there.
Yeah, I agree with the use of the words. The stories are there. It's definitely, in this case, it's a piece of woodland in the area. Farmers walk across the woodlands, they find a tall, shapeless figure behind them. They pass out and wake up the next morning. So it's got the scare factor, but it's definitely an outside spirit there. So it could be
interesting. So it doesn't correspond to what I was saying about it being a house spirit at all.
Totally, yeah.
Excellent. One you can follow up between you there later on, I think.
Thanks.
That's brilliant. Thanks, Paolo. I can put you in touch if you can't put yourselves in touch, although I'm sure you probably can. I'm a bit late to the talk, so you may have already spoken about this. I seem to remember there was a variant of boggarts called shrikers because of the noise they made. You did, I think, allude to that later on briefly. I think, I know I'm going to add to that and say that there is also a variant of black dog lore called the skriker, which is very, very similar as well. Do you consider this crossover there?
Yeah, absolutely. So particularly, and you'll know this, Mark, very, very well, but lots of these words about shape changes and particularly these canine types often relate to the noise that they would make. And so that often comes out. But for instance, in Preston, there is the shrieker, who is a woman without a head who nevertheless manages to screech and traditionally terrified the locals in happier times. Yes.
Excellent, thank you very much. Question from Leanne. How do boggarts differ from Scandinavian Nissen and Tomten?
Well, so my understanding, here I'm not at all an expert on Scandinavian law, but my understanding is Nissen particularly are related to houses, that they're house spirits or at least family spirits. And in that sense, if that is correct, and if I'm right in that assumption, then they're different kinds of terms. Nice is, if you like, a species term, and boggart is a more general term. But if you talk about the house spirit, in Lancashire, these would typically be called hobs, that they were also called the boggarts. For example, there's Barwood Hob or Barwood Boggart that lived in a house near Burnley and looked after the family there and sometimes caused trouble. Then there, the comparison with the niece is very, very close. And there is a great book to be written comparing all of the Northern European house traditions of these different spirits that have these friendly but problematic relationships with families, because there's just so much in common between the different traditions. And so this is a study for the future.
Excellent, thank you very much. Peter mentioned later on, just in a comment, Nissen is much more like a brownie, which is absolutely fair. Diane Crowbard, I was a brownie in the Girl Scouts. We learned how to cook. I have no doubt a boggart Girl Scout would have been much more dynamic. Fair point. Watching this with my 6-year-old, he wants to know, what are the most common powers a boggart has? Okay,
this is a good question. Right, without any question, the great power of the boggart, when boggarts got together and boasted about their deeds, the thing that got you to the top of the heap was your ability to terrify humans. This is what it was all about. And we do have some, I've talked in this lecture about how boggarts are solitary creatures, but there's a very curious series of stories from across England of moments when solitary creatures come together and they have a kind of a parliament meeting. So imagine this kind of meeting of all the local monsters. And I can think of one from Saddleworth in Yorkshire where 10 different boggarts came together and they boasted about which was the most frightening. And by the most frightening, they meant which could make the local farmers run the fastest.
Excellent. Good question, anonymous 6-year-old. Well done. Leanne, in the USA, the boogeyman, that would be the bogeyman, of course, in the UK, very similar etymology, would visit ill-mannered children. Is this a variant of the word boggart? Yeah,
absolutely. So one of the problems with boggart, it has various meanings. For instance, I talked to you before tonight about how it can mean scarecrow. I'm primarily interested in the supernatural meaning, but something I slowly learned was that actually there were slightly different supernatural meanings. And in parts of the Northwest, though by no means all of the Northwest, the boggart man was the scary monster of choice to terrify children. But of course, humans are never simple. And so within boggartdom, there were also areas where people were terrified of the boggart while out walking. But if they wanted to scare their kids, they would use another monster. For example, the black man is sometimes used, I think, in Bradford and the Leeds area, that part of the West Riding. So that's definitely part of the story as well. Boggarts also doubled as child scarers.
Worth pointing out, of course, that black in that terminology has no bearing on any kind of racial stereotyping, which is something that people, when they hear that term within folklore, are very, very quick to jump on, but of course has many, many other meanings within folklore, of which that is not one. This goes back to the tradition that dates all the way back into the early centuries of Christianity and arguably beyond, that the devil is black, that the devil is a black creature. Of course, the idea of the black heart. And as Mark rightly says, unfortunately today, it has other associations that can cause this confusion. But this was the historical origins of it. Yeah, absolutely. But worth clearing for the record, that one. Peter asks, this is a good question, how would you classify the Headley cow in the supernatural hierarchy? Yeah, for me, the Headley cow would be an example. I mean, going back to that shared screen, not even an example of, I'm just going to rush back, sorry, because it's easier to do. I might well regret doing this, but yeah. So for me, the Headley cow would be a type of shapeshifter. So I've put my cursor on this, but it's not a shapeshifter. It's a single shapeshifter. So in other words, you need another line coming out of shapeshifter. The Headley cow was one of a kind. It was part of this larger shapeshifter family, and that in turn was part of this larger solitary family. And in the Northeast, it would be a really interesting question to know what the word for boggart would be. My guess for Northumbria would be bogle, but I'm not 100% sure on that. That's, for me, the wrong side of England. Okay, the Garstang boggart, that's the one with the skeletal face that we saw in one of those etchings. Looks incredibly like the Tondu ghost in South Wales. I don't know what to make of that. And it's only today that I've noticed what a peculiar mask is drawn into that. This was the pleasure of really blowing up the image, getting ready for this PowerPoint presentation. I think what the illustrator is doing is having their cake and eating it. They're creating a ghost, but a ghost who could be a human being. And for me, that's what the mask suggests. And here we get into the fascinating folklore from the 19th century about the spring-heeled Jack figures, these figures who haunted the urban nights in British towns and cities. And so I suspect the illustrator was plugging into that memory there. I think it draws very much on the idea of the Victorian Edwardian ghost hoaxing fad, where people would go out and dress as ghosts and paint themselves in carcinogenic phosphorus paint and then regret it later. Of course, not just in the UK as well. I did an interview which is on my podcast with Dr. David Waldron from Australia, from the Goldfields area of Australia, who talks about the whole aspect of playing the ghost, which happened over there just as much as it did over here as well. So definitely just not just a UK phenomena. Diane, the Lancashire gentleman seems to be describing a brownie. That's the social media post that you had a slide of. The Lancashire gentleman seems to be describing a brownie. I wonder why he chose the term boggart instead.
I think that in my view, his mistake, this is how I would see it, it is a very understandable one. And it's just that if you think of those images that I showed you at the beginning, they all relate to house spirits who have this goblinoid, humanoid form. And this is the idea that's been passed down to us. And I suspect this is the kind of thing that Mark would love. But what we've had is a kind of a false folklore idea. And here I see Ron James here, and so I'm using these terms very apologetically, Ron, aware I might be about to walk into a minefield. But we've had this idea, folklorists are supposed to record folklore. What folklorists have done here is they've created folklore, but then that folklore has fed back into the population, and these have become actual beliefs there. Now, whether this is a belief that you have a spirit in the house is another question, but it's a belief in the sense that these are the traditions of our elders, when in fact it was nothing of the kind, or at least this was only a very small part of the story.
Absolutely, and this happens, of course, all the time in folklore. Doc Rowe, the first story reminds me, that's the person who comes across the head of the woman in a slide you had earlier on. The first story reminds me of the Silent Woman pub in Slaithwaite near Huddersfield, silent as she has been beheaded by a jealous husband.
Yes, no, I'm sure that she featured as a local boggart. And this business of beheaded women is very common throughout British folklore. And frequently, of course, these become boggarts, or the local equivalent, the unhappy undead, looking for vengeance. Probably the most famous case of this from my part of the UK is Fair Becca, from the western side of Bradford, who was betrayed by a suitor, according to some versions of the legends was decapitated, according to others was thrown down into a pit. And yeah, absolutely, these are very powerful folklore figures looking for justifiable revenge. The unquiet dead.
Yeah, absolutely. Peter asks, in your online census there is a lot, in capital letters, that much of a lot, of Jenny Greenteeth references. Did you ask about Jenny, or does she still have a very strong presence in the Northern consciousness?
Right, so I actually did a source book for Jenny Greenteeth, and if you're interested in Jenny Greenteeth, you can go and look at that on my academia site. But what I would say, for me, this was a little bit of a eureka moment, because when I started to study Jenny Greenteeth, and then this fed into boggarts afterwards, I'd assumed that Jenny Greenteeth had just vanished from consciousness, that she survived as a folklore idea, but not as a folklore belief. And I was absolutely astounded to find people on social media writing to me and remembering childhoods with Jenny Greenteeth in the 80s and 90s. And so in that sense, she survives. And I found one remarkable case of a grandmother who still scares her kids, not her kids, excuse me, her grandkids, with Jenny Greenteeth from the local canal. And the reason here, and old folklore is local and old folklore is personal, the reason was that in the 30s, her brother had drowned in a nearby canal. And so this had clearly traumatized the family. And so Jenny Greenteeth had survived in this family a generation beyond, I suspect, almost anywhere else. But I've been absolutely amazed at how these ideas survived. And again, 3 years ago, if someone here had been talking about this, I would have been very suspicious. But I've seen it with my own ideas. Notions that should have died out, but that haven't. And another example of this with Jenny Greenteeth is the way that Jenny Greenteeth in the 19th century was described as a boggart, whereas today this would be very unnatural because they seem to be two different kinds of things. But in the boggart census, I came across references. There's one young woman particularly who said, I think Mom used to say that Jenny Greenteeth was a boggart, but that can't be right. And of course, by Victorian logic, it is absolutely right. In other words, the mother was remembering a form of classification that in her daughter's generation had already ceased to be natural.
There's a comment from Morgan Daimler, very, very sound researcher and author on fairy subjects in their own right. And they have just noted there is a huge amount of current debate over what is or is not a fairy. Lolly has added to that. I think that debate helped by recognizing that there's quite a difference between historical ideas versus new age or modern ideas. Do you agree with that?
I certainly think that we've messed that poor word fairy around a lot. And for me, in the end, Morgan, my approach to this would be the following, and I don't know if you'd have sympathy with this or not, but for me, it's almost useful to get rid of the word fairy and think in terms of, and this is a personal hobby horse, so excuse me, but this division between the social supernatural and the solitary supernatural. And traditionally, in large parts of England and parts of Scotland and small parts of Wales and most of the Isle of Man, the term for the social supernatural has been fairies. And I think folklorists did themselves a grave disservice by extending that label to solitary beings, the solitary fairy. I think the solitary fairy is just it's like saying hot snow. It really is unhelpful. Now, I understand people get very excited about terminology, and I understand why we have lots of different definitions floating around. But when I think of fairies, that's what I fix on.
Thank you very much. Diane notes or asks to be more accurately. So to be more accurate, describe a malicious household spirit as just one type of boggart. Would one say household boggart?
No, because I think the natural term in boggartdom would have been, as it was, not in all of England, but in, let's say, 70% of England, hob. And there's this example I gave you before of a hall near Burnley, where you have the local hob, who's called Hobthirst, which would mean the hob of the forest. This strange idea that he interacts with the house, but he's also connected to the local wood. Sometimes you have these connections with household spirits, but at the same time, he's frequently called Hurstwood Boggart. And so the alternative there, I think, would be to go to that dialect word hob. I think that's what would have happened in the 19th century, and that demonstrably does in lots of cases.
Diane also added late on to the end of that as well. We need an online collection similar to the treasure trove of Irish folklore on ducas.ie, which armchair scholars can transcribe. Wouldn't that be ideal?
Wouldn't it be wonderful? This is the problem is we have to go a stage further than this. The Irish, in their wisdom, and this is all to the credit of the new republic as it was coming into being, they went out and collected that material. Now, this material is here for the UK. The problem is it's buried. So it's not just the question of transcribing the stuff. First of all, we need people to go out and find it in old newspapers, in old books. Then we need someone to transcribe it, and then the fun can begin and we can start analysing it. But that's what we need. I completely agree. And I think that's a wonderful, wonderful model, again, to use that phrase that Mark commented on, for the democratisation of knowledge, because it's not just sharing knowledge, but it's actually a communal effort in bringing it, to making it accessible to all.
Something that the folklore library would be perfect for, if we can get hold of or people can submit, and we are working very hard to do this, recorded conversations with people, as oral history conversations, written sources, handwritten sources or whatever. We can absolutely do that and make these things available for people to use and transcribe or whatever. So do engage with the folklore library if that is something that you think you can contribute to. So a couple of questions about whether you can buy the book to ship to the US, and a couple of places where you can buy it in the US. If you are in the US, I would recommend contacting University of Exeter Press. If it's not clear on their website, then email them and ask, because with that discount code, even with shipping to the US, you will probably save a fair bit on the cost of buying a copy in the US. So do get in touch with University of Exeter Press directly if you want to do that, and I'm sure they will be able to oblige. Christian, in the 1970s, I lived in Charlesworth near Glossop, Derbyshire. Opposite my house was a lane which was known locally as Boggart Lane, but had been turned by the council into School Lane. Is such sanitisation by local authorities a common cause of the loss of old folk associations?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's not at all something that's new. So this is something you've got to think that the word, particularly these words with bog in them, so boggart, bogle, there was a sense that they were not quite genteel. They were dialect words. They perhaps had unpleasant associations. And frequently they were actually already nicknames of streets that had established an official names. But we have many examples from the 19th century where these poor names got liquidized because, for example, there was a Boggart Lane on the edges of Bradford that was then sucked in as the city was growing. And there was a 30-year battle with the council to change the name. The council changed it by fiat. The locals seem not to have listened. And then within 30 years, the name started to be forgotten. But this is a problem that we can now start to get over simply because we have access to these wonderful sources. And so we can go back and we can resurrect is probably the wrong word. I'm not suggesting that we need to bring back all these names, but we can at least establish where these names were. But yeah, this is a big problem. And very often these supernatural names were nicknames. They were unofficial names. The technical term in place studies would be by names. And so the result is that they're informal words. And these are the kind of phrases that easily get lost to history.
And we find it in other aspects of folklore as well, of course. There's a famous black dog case at Uplyme, which is adjacent to a road which is now called Hay Lane, but which used to be called Dog Lane at one time. So we see it in other places as well. Lucy Evans, are there any echoes of boggarts in medieval legends?
Oh, Lucy, that's a really great question. I think this is another hobby horse of mine that I think that a new supernatural order comes into being in Britain in the early modern period. And I think that when we look at those 19th century sources, what we're actually doing is we're dipping into the very end of that period of the supernatural. However, if I was looking for something supernatural that continues from the early period and then goes through towards the modern period, I would concentrate on shape changes. I think we have several references in medieval sources to shape changing spirits. And when you look at the 19th century records for shape changing boggarts, the differences are not that dramatic. In fact, I would even go further, and at the risk of going out on a limb here, I would say that between say 1200 and 1914, not much changes in the world of shape changes. Whereas after the Great War, things change very rapidly. The shape changer seems to be reduced in its abilities. And here a lot of perhaps the more black dog traditions that Mark knows so well come to the fore. They're certainly also there before.
We are, I promise, homing in on the end of the chat. We are nearly there. Joanne, the Reader's Digest folklore tome, we all know the classic Reader's Digest folklore book, talks of a boggart called the Headless Woman who travelled with her head on a basket and made it chase after travellers after revealing her empty bonnet. Like that one. Valerie asks, where is the interface between folklore and reality, however defined, and what does it look like? Well, that's that's not a question for the end of a chat session, I don't think, is it?
That was exactly my thought. I think one of the big problems that you deal with the supernatural is the whole question: to what extent someone studying the supernatural needs to have a view on whether the supernatural exists or not. And I generally speaking, try and remain quite agnostic, both personally and publicly on that. I'm probably something of a small S skeptic. But at the same time, I think what's unquestionable is that, and this comes from perhaps more my studies with fairies in modern culture. But what's unquestionable is people have experiences, and these experiences, memorits in folklore terms, are absolutely factual for these people. Now, you can take the super skeptic position of, oh, this can't be true, or you can take the more tolerant perspective of, yes, I believe, or you can be somewhere on a spectrum in between. But I think the only way you can respectfully study the supernatural is to accept the sincerity of people who have these beliefs. And however you want to explain those beliefs and experiences, that's another question. But I think there's a need for good faith as you go into that. Now, I don't know if I've quite answered the question, but perhaps I've answered a tiny part of what's a very big question there.
That's a good starting point, isn't it? Certainly. Just two more things here. Doc has corrected my pronunciation of Sloate. Thank you very much, Doc. And Paolo just notes about names being nicknames. You wouldn't name the supernatural, but often use a nickname. For example, calling fairies the good folk. You wouldn't want to attract their attention.
Yeah, that's something that's very clear with the social supernatural, but generally speaking, at least in Britain, doesn't seem to pass over to the solitary supernatural. I would challenge anyone to find an example of people using those kind of euphemisms with the solitary supernatural. So these would be boggarts and their kin in other parts of the island. Whereas with the social supernatural, it really does seem to work. And I've come across people on the continent, folklorists on the continent, who claim it's also used in non-social settings, and I've not really seen the evidence for that, just through my own ignorance. But I would be surprised in Britain, particularly in English-speaking parts of Britain, whether euphemisms would carry over into the solitary supernatural. Whereas what you say, of course, about the social supernatural and what we would call fairies is absolutely true. And you see that even, for instance, in the northwest of England in the 19th century.
Excellent, thank you. We have reached the end of the questions. Everything else is people complimenting you on such a fantastic talk. Crowbard Diane has awarded you a webinar brownie badge from the Virtual Girl Scouts. There we go. So if nothing else, you can take that away from.
I will.
Thank you from us, obviously, at the library, and from everybody else here. Just one or two quick things that I want to tell everybody before you go. But before I do, please all take this opportunity to show your appreciation, however you wish to do so, on Zoom to Simon for a very, very in-depth and fascinating talk on the Boggart. Thank you so much, Simon.